Oh,
okay, everyone, thank you for hanging out for the second presenter. This is Dr. Mark Mattaini, and his discussion is going to be on the progressive movement, so kind of a follow-up to the grassroots advocacy and community organizing, the exciting conversation that we started back in November. So without further ado, I'll turn it right over to Dr. Mattaini.
It's really too soon to clap, except for those of you who know me. How many of you were at the presentation in the fall? Okay, just a couple. So I'll tell you first, I've been trying to figure out where it came from that we start saying things by saying so. My students and I have been trying to, it's this new thing, but apparently it came from scientists at Microsoft who started it. So when your kids, your spouses, your friends walk into the room and say, so, this is what happened today, that's where it came from. All right. And let me tell you who I am. Some of you know me really well, but some of you don't. I've been in social services since 1971. So I think I'm ahead of everybody. No. Excellent. There's advantages and disadvantages to being that old. I won't bother you with the disadvantages, you'll find out when the time comes. But I have, in my time, worked in residential treatment, in juvenile corrections, in marriage and family counseling, in drug and alcohol, in developmental disabilities, and in mental health, probably a few others. But my last full-time job before I went back to get my doctorate was I was the director of the Community Mental Health Center in Alaska. I worked in New York, I worked in Alaska, I worked in Chicago, Milwaukee, Salt Lake City, Spokane, a number of places in the Northeast also. So the big advantage, of course, of that is it gives me a lot of background when I'm doing teaching. It also has exposed me to a lot of areas of social work practice and a lot of areas of social concern that really in some ways inspired the kind of material that I'm going to talk about today. And in the fall, the idea was we had the fall presentation. We did a panel about 2 weeks after the election. And a lot of the discussion on the panel, until it came to me at least, was about how much we had to celebrate. And there were some things to celebrate, without a doubt. It looked like, and most of you have probably just come from the other presentation, it looked like the Affordable Care Act was probably safe. And that might not have been true had the election gone a different way. So that was something to celebrate. That also means that there will be some positions for social workers, because social workers are core to the kind of work that's being planned related to the Affordable Care Act. Some protections for women's right to choose and women's health in other ways. So these are things to celebrate. We thought that there was reason to celebrate social protections for the elderly. What is mostly, interestingly, started on the Republican side, what are being called entitlements. If you use the word entitlements, of course, that suggests that people are entitled or think they're entitled. That takes you to Mitt Romney and his 47%, who think that they're entitled and so forth. So I encourage us not to use the word, although everybody's probably going to, because Obama is using it as well as other folks. Okay, now, we thought that that was going to be safe. It's not clear now that it really is, and we don't know what kinds of cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are likely to happen at this point. So not as much celebration. We thought we were going to make some possible progress on violence. It's turning out to be really hard to have any impact, even on the simple little things. and most of the things that have been discussed, and magazine capacity might make a little bit of difference, but the problems that our young people have in our communities are not how big the magazines are that are being used in guns that they're not carrying, they're not using. The problems are much deeper, as we're going to be talking about. And that gives you a hint of where I'm going with a significant piece of the beginning of this presentation. Locally, you can very optimistically make a case that 60% of CPS students graduate. That really involves some playing with statistics. It wouldn't be so bad if it were 60% who graduated and who came out well prepared. But those of you who are working in the field know that there are a bunch of people who come out, they have a diploma, but they really can't read. They really can't do much in terms of math. And really can't write. Really are not prepared for a lot of jobs. Okay, and it's now become cliche to talk about the school to prison pipeline, but it's a reality, and people in Illinois really know that it's a reality. Okay, and there's going to be a lot of not so good news in the next few slides. I have to prepare you. Many of the neighborhoods, just locally in Chicago, it's true many other places as well, but locally in Chicago, there are many neighborhoods where people are afraid, where the level of violence and threat, particularly putting their children at risk, is so severe that it really is a human rights violation. People have a right to safety and security, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are many people in neighborhoods in Chicago who that right has been denied and continues to be. All right. I was in Medellin, Colombia, in South America a couple of years ago. You may, excuse me, you may know it as Medellin, but they pronounce it Medellin there. And I was doing some work with the National Police. A lot of my work in the last almost 20 years now is related to violence and violence prevention, and more recently, nonviolent social action and organizing and so forth. My career really has gone from pretty micro to pretty macro, which has been a lot of fun, and I think valuable for me. What was interesting was we were out in the neighborhoods with what they call their communitarian police. They split their police department into two parts. The communitarian police are the ones who walk through the neighborhoods now. These used to be the guys that had 8 or 10 of them sitting in the back of pickup trucks with assault weapons. Now they go in pairs and wander the neighborhood and play ball with the kids and things like that. They went through some very important processes to get there. It was absolutely inspiring to see what they had done. And then they have the law enforcement people, and they're trying to bring them along to some extent, but they chose the people who were easiest to think in terms of joining the community, being part of the community, and trained them in the communitarian approach. They also trained a bunch of young people who were pretty heavily gang involved in the drug markets, which, as you probably know, in Medellin and in Cali are the two most serious, continue to be the two most serious drug areas in Colombia. We talked to some young men who were police cadets, or had been brought in as police cadets, coming out of the gangs, trained as police cadets, then became police officers, and they have a very inspirational and transformational kind of program to make that happen, because it's not easy to pull a kid off the street and turn him into a communitarian police officer, as you might imagine. We were talking to them, and we were talking about what happens in Chicago, and these young men said, and they were so sincere, we would be happy to go there and tell them how to do it. So sweet, and so potentially true, actually. All right, so Medellin does better. In the U.S., we have the highest domestic poverty rate of any of the developed nations. We have lowest government spending as percentage of GDP for social programs to the disadvantaged. We have the largest per capita prison population in the world, not just among the developed nations, but in the world altogether. And we have the greatest and continuing to grow national income disparities on Earth, all nations on Earth. We have this will be a little controversial for some, but we have pretty much accepted a narrative of militarism, that we are to be the strongest nation on earth, that we will make sure that we have the means through drones and so forth to maintain control of the world. Very scary kinds of things in some ways. Part of what happened here, for those of you who are like my age, during the Vietnam War, lots of people were very critical of anybody in the military. So there was a really sharp divide there. So then it turned out that the veterans came back and, hey, there's some of us, and there are friends, and there are relatives, and people treated them badly. So then we moved into, particularly through some Republican administrations, to idealizing the military, but also potentially military action. And that has put us in some trouble, because when problems happen in the world, we have done some things that the data are very clear are not the best choices. There's some spectacular data. This is a little bit of an aside, but it's a hopeful thing that I can tell you. There's some wonderful data. A friend of mine out of Denver University has put together, looking at 300 violent and nonviolent kinds of campaigns. Turns out that if you're trying to change a country, you're trying to get rid of a dictator, you're trying to have a revolution, you've got better than 50% chance of success with a nonviolent campaign. You've actually got only about a 5% chance of coming out the other end with a democratic outcome with a violent insurgency. So, but we're still supporting all of those violent approaches to doing this stuff. Okay, there's more, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. All right, I'm almost through with this disheartening stuff, but in the world, escalating global disparities in terms of income, which we know the U.S. military has paid a lot of attention to this, as they have to climate change, because they see the tremendous risks involved. As you get a growing proportion of very poor people with no possibility of advancing and going anywhere, the chances for maintaining social stability goes down dramatically. And unprecedented levels of structural violence. Paul Farmer, any of you know Paul Farmer's name? Some of you probably do. Farmer is the physician and anthropologist. He's the man that many of you probably have heard about, who has worked in Haiti, in the poorest areas of Haiti, for over 30 years. He's also worked in the Russian prison system, which is one of the worst in the world, a bunch of places in Africa, and a number of other places. A wonderful and inspirational man that I make my students read some of his work, and they walk away inspired, because he is really inspirational. And he talks about the pathologies of power, the way that economic systems are set up to keep some people powerless. And unfortunately, the people who are the poorest in the world, many of them die because of poverty. So he sees that as a form of violence. Even though it's economic, there's no weapons involved. Okay. And this guy named Chris Hedges, who's been in the news quite a bit lately, used to be a New York Times reporter, has written a book called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. He talks about the sacrifice zones in the U.S., places like Pine Ridge, places like Flint, Michigan, places like Camden, New Jersey, places like some of the mining communities in Appalachia, places where there are farm workers in Florida and some places in the West, people who have been entirely left out of any kind of social planning and have absolutely no social safety net. Often the undocumented folks are among those, particularly among the farm workers. Okay, I think there's one more slide, and then we'll move to something a little bit more optimistic. Climate change. Turns out that it's really clear, there's a bunch of research that's been done on this now. Climate change is going to have profound economic implications, profound implications for food security, profound implications for health, because as the world gets warmer, there are all kinds of organisms that develop better than they do when it's cold. And So it turns out that climate change, for sure, there's nothing we can do about it right this minute that's going to prevent in 20 and 30 years tremendous hardship for the most disadvantaged folks. It's going to take longer than that, even if we take it seriously. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because we're not taking it seriously. Okay, globalization of violence, and all of these things have some ties to the shared ideology of unconstrained global corporate capitalism, grounded in ever-expanding consumption.